Here's a common belief. The rich retire early and the poor keep working. But here's the reality. Across all major data sets, the opposite pattern keeps showing up again and again. High earners are much more likely to keep working into their late 60s and 70s. Low earners retire earlier, often not by choice. About 30% of Americans aged 65 to 74 are still working. Hey guys, what's up? I'm great and welcome back. This means a large chunk of retirement age Americans are still working, and this often affects how incomes look in retirement. So let's take a deep dive and look into who gets to choose when they retire and who doesn't. Most people don't plan to retire early. Despite what we often see talked about online in the financial space, when researchers ask Americans when they plan to retire, most Americans say they want to work well into their 60s, and some even say they want to work into their 70s.
And most say the intention is pretty simple. They want to boost their savings, maybe delay Social Security, or simply ease into retirement. But when we look at what actually happens in real life, we see that there is a big gap between the plan and reality. And this gap has been present for decades. About 60% of workers end up retiring earlier than they planned. 60%, no matter how many times I see that stat, it always shocks me because that means the vast majority of us are going to end up retiring sooner than we originally planned. And among workers who said they plan to keep working until age 66 or later, more than half never actually make it there. So for a huge portion of Americans, early retirement isn't some financial victory. Rather, it's something that just happens to them. And mostly, it's not happening because they hit a target savings goal. Rather, it's life tends to get in the way. The biggest drivers are things like health problems, their own or a spouse's physically demanding jobs that become harder on the body over time, layoffs in the late 50s or early 60s when finding a comparable job gets much harder, and caregiving responsibilities. Stepping in to care for aging parents or partners. In other words, people aren't waking up at 61 saying, "Great news, I've saved enough, I'm retiring early." For many Americans, they're being pushed out of the workforce earlier than they had planned. For many, early retirement is often involuntary. This is one of the most important things to understand about retirement in America. For many people, working longer is the plan they hope to follow. But once real life steps in, it's often a reality we don't get to control. Here's where the story really flips from what most people expect. When you break labor force participation down not just by age, but by income level, a very clear pattern shows up. Data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics breaks down who is still working at older ages, and they link it strongly to income and education. Here's the general finding. The higher your income was throughout the course of your life, the more likely you are to be working in your late 60s and even well into your 70s. Let's look at the late 60s group first. Among Americans aged 65 to 69, roughly 20 to 25% of lower-income individuals are still working. In the middle income range, that increases to about 30 to 35%. But among higher-income individuals, it jumps to roughly 45 to 50% or more still working. So in the same age range, late 60s, higher earners are almost twice as likely to still be in the workforce compared to lower earners. And that gap doesn't disappear as people get older. When you look at ages 70 to 74, only about 10 to 15% of lower-income Americans are still working. But among high-income Americans, it's closer to 25 to 30%. Again, roughly double the participation rate. The higher you go up the income ladder, the more likely someone is to continue working later on in life. So this leads to the surprising reality where we often picture the people who are retiring early and living up the dream are actually the ones who are working latest in life. Meanwhile, the ones you think might work forever or the longest are often the ones who are forced out earlier than they anticipated. So once you really see the data, it often changes how you think about retirement. For many people, retirement often isn't about motivation or work ethic. It's often about who has the ability to keep working and who doesn't. Once you see who keeps working longer, the next question is obvious. Why? The answer really comes down to structure. Higher earners generally work longer because they have the health and the ability to do so. So many higher income earners are in white-collar positions or professional positions, and these are jobs that are typically less physically demanding, more flexible with hours, and more open to part-time work, consulting, or gradual retirement. Data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows that people who continue working into their later ages are often in a professional setting or an office setting. They really aren't in physically intensive fields. Meanwhile, physically demanding jobs like construction, manufacturing, transportation, and caregiving see much steeper drop-offs in employment as people reach their late 50s and early 60s. Some jobs are simply easier to keep as your body ages, others aren't, and health plays a huge role too. Long-term data from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention shows that lower-income workers experience higher rates of chronic illness, earlier onset of disability, and more physical wear and tear. Conditions like arthritis, heart disease, diabetes, and mobility issues tend to appear earlier and more frequently in lower-income populations, the same groups more likely to work in physically demanding jobs. So many higher-income earners reach their late 60s or their 70s, and they are healthy enough to keep working, whereas many lower-income earners face physical limitations earlier on. And then there's flexibility. Higher-earning careers often come with options like remote work, reduced schedules, consulting, or project-based roles, gradual step-downs instead of full stops. Lower-wage positions rarely offer that. If you're in a field that is physically demanding, it may not be possible to step down into a part-time position or find comparable work even if you want to continue working, but your body doesn't allow you to. So, when you put it all together, higher earners and lower earners are often facing different situations. Yes, retirement timing is of course tied to finances, but it's also tied to health, job type, flexibility, and control. This is where wealth changes everything because wealth gives you options. It allows you to continue working on perhaps your own schedule. It allows you to shift down into a part-time role if that's something you want. And it gives you options to really retire on your own terms. Now, let's talk about an interesting data point. If you look at information from the Federal Reserve as reported by DQYDJ, you'll see that the median individual income for someone over the age of 65 is around $70,000. When you look at that number, your first thought might be, that seems high. I thought most retirees or most people age 65 and older were living on Social Security. But here's a key thing to keep in mind. Once you get into this age group, all of a sudden we're looking at two very different household types. We have fully retired households and households that are still earning paychecks. When we look at the median income of a retired individual or a retired household, the median income drops to about $55,000. And for retired households over 75, it drops further to about $38,000. These are dramatically different numbers. Let's start with what the Social Security Administration shows about earnings in retirement. Among Americans aged 65 to 69, back in 1980, earnings made up about 28% of total household income. Fast forward 40 years, and that number has jumped to about 42% of total income. In other words, work income has become a much bigger part of what people in their late 60s live on. And it's not just a small group. About 47% of people aged 65 to 69 were still earning income. Around 30% at ages 70 to 74, and nearly 20% even at ages 75 to 79. So a huge portion of retirement age households aren't retired at all. They're still working. And once you layer in census data, a clear pattern emerges. A disproportionate share of those who are still earning an income after the age of 65 are college-educated, higher lifetime earners, and people from professional and white-collar careers. Meanwhile, many lower-income households have left the workforce entirely. They're relying heavily or solely on Social Security and have modest, if anything, in investments. So if we look at average income for a household aged 65 and up, those average incomes often look disproportionately large, and they look that way because we often have high earners who are continuing to work in the workforce. And once you understand who tends to retire earlier, and who keeps working longer, the next pattern almost perfectly lines up with it. And that is when people claim Social Security. Data from the Social Security Administration and the Health and Retirement Study show a very clear divide. Lower earners are much more likely to claim benefits early, typically between ages 62 and 64. Higher earners, on the other hand, are far more likely to delay claiming either to full retirement age or even all the way up to 70 when benefits max out. On the surface, this can look like a simple financial choice, but once you connect it back to retirement timing, a deeper story emerges. Here's what researchers consistently find. Many people tend to claim Social Security while still working, but often they fall into two very different groups. The first group is lower income earners. Many claimed out of financial necessity. Maybe they were forced out of full-time work earlier than they planned. They saw their income drop sharply, and they didn't have much in the way of savings. So they claimed Social Security out of financial necessity. Social Security was a lifeline. The second group is those higher income earners. They've remained employed into their late 60s. They could afford to delay benefits, and maybe they're relying on flexible work or part-time work. Many claim while continuing to work. Typically, they wait until full retirement age. That way, they can continue to earn a substantial income without worrying about hitting any sort of earnings limit. So, Social Security claiming isn't just about optimization. It reflects the same structural divide we see with retirement itself. Lower earners are more likely to retire earlier and claim earlier. Higher earners are more likely to keep working longer and delay benefits. Claiming behavior often mirrors who gets a choice and who doesn't. So here's the pattern that we see. People who have better health, more flexible positions, and higher lifetime earnings don't just have more wealth and more money. They have more control over timing, control over when they stop working, over when they claim benefits, over how gradually they transition into retirement. Let's do an example. I like putting numbers to these ideas to really make them concrete. First, let's look at a lower income household. Imagine a married couple where both spouses earned about $40,000 a year on average over their careers. They plan to keep working into their late 60s, but due to health issues and layoffs, both are forced to retire early and ended up claiming Social Security at age 62. Now, for workers at that income level, Social Security typically replaces about half of their pre-retirement earnings if they claim at full retirement age. So, if they had been able to wait until age 67, each spouse might have received around $20,000 a year in benefits, but because they had to claim early, their benefits are permanently reduced by roughly 30%. So, instead of about $20,000 a year each, they end up receiving closer to $14,000 a year each. That's roughly $1,167 per month per person. Put together, this household is receiving roughly $28,000 a year total, or about $2,333 a month from Social Security. And important to keep in mind, because they've been forced to retire early, they're no longer working and they no longer have earned income. So, it's likely that Social Security is really the bedrock or the vast majority of their income in retirement. If they're lucky, they might have a pension to help supplement this income and modest savings. But because they were modest earners, it's likely that they have modest investments because incomes and investments tend to correlate. Now let's compare that to a higher income household. Imagine another married couple where both spouses earned about $90,000 a year on average over their careers. They're healthier, their jobs are less physically demanding, and they have more flexibility. So they're able to keep working all the way up to full retirement age at 67 before claiming Social Security. At that income level, Social Security replaces a smaller percentage, usually around 30% of earnings. So each spouse ends up receiving about $27,000 a year in benefits. That's roughly $2,250 a month each. Together, their Social Security income alone is about $54,000 a year. But here's the big difference. One spouse continues working part-time, maybe consulting, maybe reduced hours, and earns an additional $40,000 a year. So this household's total income in retirement looks like $54,000 from Social Security and $40,000 from part-time work. In total, they're getting $94,000 a year, or just under $8,000 a month. They're also much more likely to have robust savings and investments that they could draw on because they were higher earners. They could likely put more away throughout their working careers. But because one is continuing to work and they have robust Social Security benefits, they might not need to touch their investments right away or at all, while one is continuing to work part-time. This allows their investments to continue to grow. Now put those two households side by side. The lower income couple was forced to retire early and claim Social Security benefits at 62. They're receiving about $28,000 a year in benefits. This might represent their total income. We don't know their full picture. The higher income couple may be able to work longer and keep earning. And if that's the case, they could be earning $94,000 a year. That's more than 3 times as much income. And notice the key driving differences here. We're not just saying that one household saved better. We haven't even talked about saving or investments yet. It's that one household was able to work longer. They avoided early claiming penalties. They earned more over their lifetimes, which translated into more robust benefits, and they had the flexibility to keep bringing in income after retirement age. So the big question is, if this retirement divide is real and so many people end up retiring earlier than they planned, what can you actually do about it? How can you use this information to actually move the needle in your life? Well, let's break it down with some practical steps. First, and this is the most important one, don't build your entire retirement plan around the assumption that you'll definitely work into your late 60s or 70s. Hope is not a strategy. The data shows that for the lion's share of Americans, life has a way of getting in the way. There may be health changes, jobs might disappear, you may have to step into a caregiving role. Instead of having just one retirement plan, you really want layers of protection. Think in terms of Plan A is working to your ideal age. Plan B is retiring earlier than expected, and make sure Plan B still works. This usually means saving a little bit more than the bare minimum that you could otherwise get away with. It means avoiding too much lifestyle inflation over time and really building flexibility into your budget. This is creating a realistic plan. Second, focus on career flexibility, not just savings. One of the biggest advantages higher income earners often have isn't just money, it's options. The ability to do part-time work, remote work, flexible schedules, or even gradually shifting into retirement. So ask yourself, can I build skills that translate into flexible work later in life? Can I position my career so I'm not locked into physically demanding work forever? Even small moves and adopting new skill sets can massively increase your ability to continue working later if you want to. If you're not relying on a physically demanding job, sometimes having additional skills that give you the option to continue working could easily translate to the alternative of having several hundreds of thousands of dollars in investments producing an income, because you have that ability to continue working. Third, understand how critical Social Security timing really is. For many households, especially lower and middle income earners, Social Security really is the foundation of retirement income. And the earlier you claim, the lower you make this foundation. Whenever possible, you want to protect your ability to decide when you claim rather than being forced to claim. This might mean beefing up an emergency fund if you're forced to retire early, so you could have savings and investments to draw on until you decide when it's most ideal for you to claim Social Security. Or maybe it means taking on part-time work to serve as a bridge again. So, you can delay claiming Social Security because sometimes, depending on your income, depending on your savings and your investments, deciding to claim at 62 could be very different than claiming at 65 or 67. Fourth, this may be the biggest takeaway of all. Your health is one of the most important retirement assets you have. No matter what career you're in, no matter how much you earn, no matter what your stage of life, your health is often the biggest determining factor on when you retire, when you're able to stop working, how long you're able to keep earning if you want to, and what your retirement actually looks like day to day. People who are healthier often get to control their retirement timing. People whose bodies break down earlier often don't get that choice. It's about making your health a priority today in realistic ways. Getting regular movement, eating better most of the time, managing stress, and seeing doctors when something feels off. No matter if you decide to retire earlier or keep working longer, you want to have the longest possible health span. You want the most years where you feel good, the most years where you have more energy, and the more years where you have options to do what you want in your life. So, the biggest lesson in all of this is pretty simple. Retirement success isn't just about how much you save. It's about how flexible you can make your career, how protected your plan is against a forced early retirement, and how much control you can really build into your timeline. The more options you can build into your life financially and career-wise, the more likely it is that you're going to get to retire on your own terms. So, what are your thoughts on flexibility and options? I'd love to hear in a comment down below. I post new videos every single week. If you got anything at all out of this one, please give it a like. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. Or if you know of someone who might get something out of this type of content, please consider sharing. I'll see you soon. Bye. Winter is brutal. My dog is growling in the background too. So I'm kind of concerned that that's going to be on voice, so hopefully not. Oh my gosh, I'm going to disown him. I really am one of these days. You love him so much, but like, oh, the static electricity, it's killing me today. Hey guys, what's up? Hey guys, it's Monday. I don't even know how I start these videos.